All right, good evening. It's Mother's Day. It's time for a new book. We're beginning in the book of Daniel. And we'll be doing this each Sunday evening, launching it at 6 o'clock. You can watch it anytime, all week long, or you can actually go back and, if you want to read a particular book and study along with it, go back in the archives, and eventually we may have the whole Bible if we live long enough. We've got a lot of them built up already in the New Testament, Old Testament in our Bible studies, but we're beginning the book of Daniel, where we'll be for the next 4 months, I guess it is, 3 months, 12 chapters. That'd be 3 months, 3 times 4. So chapter 1 is laying the groundwork for the rest of the book. We need to know the background. Then about the first half of the book, I think it's about an even split, is history in the book of Daniel. Then the second half is prophecy. But to understand prophecy, you've got to understand the history. It kind of goes together. And then you look at the prophecy, and the more time goes on, the more we understand some of the prophecy that didn't make sense before. Still don't pretend to understand it all, but we're still studying, and it's almost like we're living in the day exactly, I guess, when you can watch the news on TV and then look at your Bible in the other hand and kind of compare some of the things a lot of times. So here we are, chapter 1 of Daniel. A terrible thing had happened back down here in Israel. It was in the time when the nation was split into the two kingdoms, and Jerusalem is under attack. It's the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. He was king up then at Israel, at Judah, but Jerusalem was in Judah at that point. And so during that time, in his third year of reign, here comes old King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. The enemies come unto Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, we can read in the other books, we find out what they would do is they'd attack the city several different times over the years, and it took several years, but they would carry POWs off, and there was about 3 different waves of them before the final wave was the third one. And Daniel goes in one of these waves early on, it looks like. He's carried off as a POW as a young man. We think Daniel was maybe around 17 years old when he's taken captive and got carried off to Babylon. And that's significant because Daniel lives a full life and is 70 years later until King Cyrus comes along and lets the POWs go back to their homeland. Daniel's instrumental in taking that. Looks like Daniel never did. He spent his whole life after he's carried off down there in Babylon, and he wrote this record for us here. So the Lord gave Jehoiakim, verse 2, king of Judah, into his hand. Nebuchadnezzar takes Jerusalem and the king Jehoiakim. And he also takes with him, his army does, part of the vessels of the house of God. That's only we've made it a verse and a half, but that'll factor into the story later on during the fall when Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, I think it is, gets them out, and that's finally the fall of Babylon when his grandpa's had them stored there. But he's taken them and he stored them in the part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, Nebuchadnezzar's God, which is not the same God as Daniel's God. And contrary to some of the things you hear today, we don't all worship the same God. I mean, just because somebody's using the term God, there's many different gods, but there's only one true God. And that's the Creator God, the Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, that is only approachable through Christ. So here's how it is. It's very narrow, that there's the Christian God, and the only way to approach that God is through Christ. Otherwise, you're not in the relationship with that God. You can be serving some other God that's no God. So he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Verse 3, and the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs. Ashpenaz, I think I said his name right. And who was now what would happen is the king would have all these young men, and they would make eunuchs out of them. And the king was really pretty smart. What he was doing here is he would realize, hey, there's some people in this world that's smarter than us, smarter than ours. There's a lot of wisdom in these other places that we're capturing over here. We want to find out in some of these POWs and build a real brain trust here and figure out some of these guys and be kind to them and get them on our side, and we can use this smartness, if you would, intelligence. So the king spake to Ashpenaz, master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed or descendants, his own Babylonian people, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, the most beautiful ones, the most well-favored ones, the ones who were skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, by whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So the king sent his chief of the eunuchs, the one who was over the barracks of the eunuchs, I guess you would say, prison guard, sort of. He said, you find me the prettiest ones, the most well-favored, the skillful in wisdom, the cunning in knowledge, the ones who understand science, and they have ability. I want to use them. We'll bring them over here, and we're going to train them for 3 years. The king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat or food, and of the wine which he drank. So nourishing them for 3 years. 3 years. He's going to school for 3 years now. Now, remember this. Daniel was very intelligent. We know this much already. And he's going to learn a whole lot more by the time he writes this book. So the point is that the Bible wasn't written by a bunch of ninnies with blind faith. There was some sheep herders and just common fishermen and everything else that wrote things in the Bible, but there were some of the most intelligent people in their day, like Daniel, or like Moses, who was brought up in the best learning of the Egyptians in his day, or like the Apostle Paul, who went to the university of his day, the school of Gamaliel. You can find out in the book of Acts. So these are some really intelligent people who wrote this record. God used to write this record for us. So verse 5, the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and the wine which he drank, nourishing them for 3 years, that at the end of the end thereof, they might stand before the king. He's going to train them for 3 years and teach them what they know, and he's going to use these bright young brains, and after 3 years of training, he's going to bring them in and examine them. Now, among these, verse 6, were the children of Judah, Daniel, and then there's 3 names that you may not recognize because it's their Jewish names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We know them because they're going to give them Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Sort of funny that we know Daniel by his Jewish name, but we know the other 3 by their Babylonian names. So Daniel gets a Babylonian name too, but we just always call him Daniel. Maybe because Daniel referred to himself in his book as Daniel. We're reading the book of Daniel, not the book of Belteshazzar, right? So among these, verse 6, were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Verse 7, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs, one over the eunuch barracks, he gave them names, and he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar. And unto Hananiah he called him Shadrach, and Mishael he called him Meshach, and Azariah he called him Abednego. So what they're trying to do is make Babylonians out of them, right? Giving them Babylonian names too. But Daniel, he purposed in his heart. Now, that means he made a conscientious decision based on the conviction in his heart. Anything you're going to do for God, you got a purpose in your heart. You're going to say something like, I'm going to honor and glorify God in my Christian life. Well, the number one thing you can do to honor and glorify God in your Christian life is to be faithful and supportive of God's church. So your purpose in your heart, like I'm going to be faithful to my church. I'm going to be there, and I'm going to support my church with my prayers and presence and giving and every way you can. You got to purpose that in your heart because it don't just happen. You got to make a decision based on conviction. Purpose it in your heart. Verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat. He ain't going to eat that king's food because some of it, as a Jew, he'd read back in here in these books of Moses that I'm not supposed to eat that or this or that. So I'm not going to do that. And he said, I'm not going to drink that wine which the king wants us to drink. Therefore he requested, and he wasn't in any position to demand, see, he could only request to, as he went up the ladder. He couldn't go straight to the king, but he could talk to the prince of the eunuchs that was in charge of his barracks. So he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So we want to eat something else. Now, God, verse 9, had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. In other words, the prince of the eunuchs over time had really taken a liking to Daniel. He was sympathizing with him. And he really wanted to honor Daniel's request, but you put yourself in this prince of the eunuchs place too, and you got to sympathize with him. He says, I'd really like to do that, but you're going to jeopardize my head. You know, I've got to answer to my king, and I fear my king. What if I let you guys eat what you want, but when it comes time for the day, you don't look as good as the rest of them do, and you look unhealthy? He's liable to behead me. So the prince of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who's appointed your meat and your drink. It was his menu you've been eating. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Why should you not look as good as the rest? And he's going to ask me, and I'm going to have to tell him, and I'm going to be in trouble. Then shall you make me endanger my head to the king. So Daniel sympathized with him, kind of give and take here. Daniel made a request. He said, I don't believe I can do that. And Daniel says, well, how about this? Verse 11, Daniel says to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel says to him in verse 12, now we'll prove your servants, or test us. Let's do a little test here. Test your servants, and I beseech thee, 10 days. We're going to do a 10 days test. How's this? And at the end of 10, you let us for 10 days eat what we want on the menu, instead of what that rich, fatty stuff that the king's pushing toward us. And give us pulse, is the King James word, to eat. As my footnote says, vegetables. I'd read somewhere else it's actually beans, which is a vegetable. And let us go on the veggie and water diet, or the beans and water diet. Give us 10 days. Can we do that? Yeah, I mean, this is a 3-year thing they're in training. He says, give us a 10-day test here. And then you look at us. Not when we go into the king, but, now. You let our countenance be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the other ones, the children that eat the portion of the king's meat. And you decide, as thou seest, deal with thy servants. You can surely give us a 10-day test. That's a reasonable request. So he consented. The guy over him consented to them in this matter. And he proved them, or tested them, for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fair and fatter. They looked healthier than the other bunch did. I don't know, if I just eat beans and water for 10 days, I'd probably look healthier too. I'd probably lost a few pounds, quit eating that. I just had a Twinkie with a cup of coffee in there. At the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's food meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. He said, okay, you guys win. You're looking pretty good. If you get to looking real poor now, we're going to have to go back. He's probably telling them, but I'm going to let you eat what you want, because you're looking good. Verse 17, but as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. Now, think about this for a minute. These boys, these 4 boys, they were God's children, been carried off out of Jerusalem, and they feared God, and they served God, and they worshiped God, and God gave them knowledge. And remember, the proverb says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge. So God gave them that knowledge because they feared Him first of all. You can get a good education and it be godless, and you still not any better off than you was. And He gave them skill in all learning. Now think about that for a minute. God didn't just zap them and they knew everything. God gave them skill in learning. And the learning part is that they were able to comprehend the things that they were set before them, and they were able to use that. But that requires the work on their half and on your half. Learning is your thing, right? You ask God to bless your efforts in learning and wisdom. And Daniel, now this part here is entirely supernatural. I don't think you can learn this last part. Daniel had a gift. It was understanding in all visions and dreams. Now, back in that day, God spoke to a lot of people through visions and dreams. We've got something they didn't have. We've got 66 books of this Bible. That's how God speaks to us. But God spoke to Daniel and other people. He was able to interpret other people in visions and their visions and dreams too. Even godless peoples that we're going to see, he's going to be brought in and interpret them for him because he's got that gift here of dream interpretation. 18. Now, at the end of the days, or at the end of the 3 years, I think, their test, their training, they went to a 3-year university in Babylon. At the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before, O King Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them. That means he brought them around, set them around, maybe one at a time, maybe as a group, but he discussed things with them. He talked to them. He communed with them. And he's fishing, to see who's smart, who's really understands these things, who's the cream of the crop that we may have here. So the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, whom we're going to know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego later in Daniel. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them. That's a rounded education, right? In all matters that he asked them questions about, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. This is really pretty smart of King Nebuchadnezzar, right? He realizes, hey, they smarter people in the world than maybe just the ones that I've got. Let's see who they are. So he found them 10 times smarter than his own guys that he had, magicians and astrologers that he had. And verse 21 simply tells us that Daniel continued even to the first year of King Cyrus, which is 70 years later. Daniel's, there for at least 70 years. That's just verse 21 is just telling us that he's there for life. He's got a life sentence pretty much. We'll see you next week and we'll get into chapter 2.